It's time for Africa, time to discuss matters that affect the continent. Thank you for joining us on the show. And this week, we host James Mwangi, who is a managing partner at Dalberg, an international strategy consulting firm. He's based in Johannesburg, South Africa. He shares his insights with us. You get to have your say on the issues as well. You're watching the Africa Leadership Dialogues. I'm Julie Gishuru. James Mwangi is the global managing partner of Dalberg, an international strategy consulting firm with 12 offices across the globe. He's based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Prior to this, James founded and led Dalberg's business in Africa after helping build its first office in New York. Clients range from heads of state to senior leaders of multilateral organizations and foundations. Before this, James worked at McKinsey and Company in New York, serving clients mostly in the financial services sector. James holds an honors degree in economics from Harvard University. He's a 2009 Archbishop Tutu Leadership Fellow of the African Leadership Institute and serves on the Institute's board. He's also a 2013 Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum and currently serves on the Program Advisory Committee of the Clinton Global Initiative. Let's get his insights into Africa. It's great to have you with us on the Africa Leadership Dialogues. James, thank you so much for making time.
Thank you very much.
Young African man, amazing educational portfolio, now working with Dalberg. Tell us your story. Start at the beginning. Tell us how you grew up, a little bit about your education, what you're doing right now.
Thank you, Julie. I was born, like many of your audience, in Kenya. I was born in Nairobi. Grew up in the public school system. Went to, I'll actually list every school I went to. Went to Our Lady of Mercy Primary School, public school in South B in Nairobi. Was fortunate enough to get into Alliance High School 4 years. And at the end of that, was asked by my principal to, consider applying, or by my deputy principal at that time to consider applying to US universities. Didn't know much about it, submitted an application. To my surprise, was accepted at Harvard.
Did your parents have the money to take you to the US?
The beauty of that was actually it didn't matter. So Harvard and a few other universities in the US have a policy they call need-blind admission. And so while my parents were able to put in a little bit of the cost, maybe 5 to 10%, the university basically has a policy that says if they accept you, then they will give you the resources you need in order to attend. Now, some of that is in the form of loan, some of it is in the form of a scholarship. But they accepted me and I was able to attend for 4 years. And after that, I was very keen on working in development, but I wasn't sure how. And I applied to all the usual places, the World Bank, the UN system, and the rest. And none of them really responded quickly. At the same time, I began to feel like I needed to have some exposure to business. So I joined a consulting firm, McKinsey and Company, in New York, and spent 2 years there working with private sector companies for the most part in finance, logistics, and so on, essentially helping them develop strategies to get better at their business. And it was at the end of that period that I made the decision to jump and help the team that was getting Dalberg off the ground.
Right. With Dalberg now, what's the focus of the work that you do?
Dalberg is in some ways a very simple story, and in some other ways a complicated story. We are a strategy consulting and advisory firm, but we are that with a difference. So we work with clients across the public, private, and social sectors, and we do the same kind of consulting work that any other world-class consulting firm would do. The only difference is that we demand that all of our work have a positive development impact. In other words, we only take on assignments that we believe will enhance the world's inclusiveness or sustainability in one way or another. What that plays out as is that we mostly focus on either working with the development sector, with governments, with foundations, but then also with companies in cases where we're trying to get them to think of either the excluded majority as customers, as employees, as sources of resources, etc. And so unlike many other international or global consulting firms, we've ended up focusing our efforts where most people only think of as an afterthought. So Africa for us is really a big part of the heart of what we do, as is East Asia, and South Asia, as is Latin America. In a way, we're the reverse of a typical firm that will say, well, our center and our focus is Europe, the US, maybe Japan and China. Instead, we say our focus is these other countries where we think the massive opportunity for creating prosperity really exists.
Yeah. Wow. So let's come to Africa today and the potential on the continent. I was just reading recently that Eric Schmidt of Google said they're now getting more clicks on their AdSense adverts in Africa than they are in Europe. And so his focus now has shifted. A lot of people saying that obviously the growth in the markets of Africa is going to be significant, looking at the saturated markets of the West. And what do you see in terms of potential for Africa?
So Africa is a complicated story. On the one hand, there are some really exciting underlying trends here. If you look at history in general, you find that for most countries that come out of a colonial experience, you typically go through a period of 30 to 40 years of just working that out in terms of a generational and mindset shift, etc., before you can really take off and start to grow. You look at what happened with India, where in the late 80s, early 90s, things began to change and it began to build momentum. Now, granted, it's having issues now, but it changed the way that the country thought of itself and what aspirations it had. Africa is entering that phase now. We're seeing a final shift away from the language of anti-colonialism, for example, into saying, well, what are we going to do with the freedom that we have? So that's one bit of good news, and you're starting to see it in the way that we want to do bigger things. The other bit of good news is we're the youngest continent. And that has two sides to it, but let's talk about the good side of that first. That means we have the most dynamic and youngest workforce in the world, and it's going to get bigger and bigger over the next few years. Now, all of that means that we have the potential to be a tremendously productive part of the world's economy. We can be the world's workshop if we put our minds to it. At the same time, Africa is the least explored continent for a range of natural resources. Our agriculture is tremendously unproductive. In other words, we don't get as much out of our land as we could. Basically, on every single dimension of economic activity, we're very far from where we could be. Now, on one hand, that's bad news because it means we are not making the most of our potential today. On the other hand, it means that if we're serious about seizing that potential, the sky is the limit, the world is our oyster. But that brings me to the flip side of it. That youth bulge, that youth dividend, that demographic dividend can turn into a time bomb. And we're seeing it in North Africa, in other parts of the continent. In other words, if we don't create the equitable and sustainable society that is creating the jobs for people, then we will be swept away.
I had a fascinating tweet from someone. We were discussing innovation in young people. You've just talked about the youth bulge. And this young person said, if the youth are not economically empowered, they cannot become productive.
Yeah.
But let's define that. What do we need then to do to ensure that we get the most out of the youth bulge on the continent?
I think it's a few things. One, at the end of the day, getting the most out of people is about tapping into their potential. And everything I'm going to say is nothing new. It's about getting people the basic skills they need to be effective in an economy through education. Education
and training.
And not stopping there, because very often we do education and training in one corner and then we say, now go out and find jobs. Actually, the way it should work is you should integrate the process. The transition from learning to earning needs to be a smooth one. You think about traditional societies. There wasn't a day when you're told, okay, now you're no longer a child, you will go out and work. You slowly became an apprentice. You learned how to work in a trade. You did more and more work on your own, and then one day you looked around and said, oh, I'm self-sufficient. You look at economies like Germany's, for many, many years, their whole setup for the bulk of their population was one that revolved around apprenticeships, around learning a trade, around learning to work in their medium-sized industries, and then transitioning into the workplace. Our problem in Africa is we've created this idea that first you're in school, and when you're in school, all you do is read books, and then you go into the workplace and you apply this knowledge that you picked up. Your challenge is even the youth with university degrees show up patently unprepared for the challenges of the workplace.
That is true.
Right? And let alone the ones with a primary or secondary school education. And so the real challenge for us is focusing on that bridge. It's focusing on that transition from being someone who is picking up skills to someone who's applying them in the workplace, and giving people just the soft skills around how you behave in a workplace, how you expect to be treated.
So whose role is that? Is that, does that fall on the universities? Does that fall on some kind of transitional process between universities? Is it then private sector that should come in and say, we want to play a role in this? How do you see this working?
All of the above.
Okay.
We're doing a lot of work now in South Africa and indeed across the continent, looking at exactly that question of how do you manage that transition. And we've been focusing on high school graduates because a majority of African youth are going to be leaving school with either a primary school education or a secondary school education. Very few will actually get a university education, although the lessons still apply there. And what we're finding is we have a paradox in Africa. On the one hand, we're saying that there's a lot of youth without jobs. On the other hand, there's many industries that are saying they can't find the people to hire, or that the cost of acquiring talent is so high, not just because it's hard to find the right person, but because you hire one, they stay for 3 months, you have to dismiss them or they leave, and you hire another one. So that churning of people in and out of the workplace is bad for the employer, but it's also bad for the young person. Some analysis recently, which I found shocking, said that if a young person is able to stay in their first job for a year, their chances of staying in employment throughout their lives go up by 80%. So the reason why you see people unemployed out on the street today very often is because they never got that first opportunity to sit in a job, learn what it means to pull down a wage in a situation where they are being coached, they are being helped. And once you get through that first year, you're okay. You can find the next job and the job after that. Plus, you're a cheaper employee for your employer because they brought you in, they didn't waste 3 or 6 months orienting you in the workplace. You actually stayed and gave them value. So it's actually getting everyone you talked about, the educational institution, the employer, and very often some social sector player, to sit down and say, how do we help these youth get what they need? If you look at an advanced economy, your parents can tell you how to behave in a workplace because they're in that same kind of workplace. The majority of our youth are coming from a rural subsistence agriculture background. There's no one who's going to tell them how to behave in an office or in a workshop in their household. So you have to do that work you have to create a structure that does that for them.
That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that information. And I think, a lot of people right now thinking about how they can play a role, whether you're in private sector, whether you're in education, maybe you need to start thinking of how you can play a role in being part of that transitional element there. Let's talk about government now. And there's definitely the problem that in many ways we are over-reliant on government.
Absolutely.
And we look at government as the beginning and the end of everything. The aid mentality. At the same time, there are many areas that government should be subsidizing that it's not. Where's the balance?
So if I had the answer in 3 sentences, I would be somewhere else. No, it's an ongoing debate. I will say that there's a lot of research now that is proving that there's 2 camps of people out there. There's a camp of people saying aid has not made any country rich, and that actually you need private industry and private investment to grow economies. There's another camp that says actually development assistance over the last few decades has done a tremendous amount to help people in situations that they would not otherwise have been helped out of. The funny thing is they're both exactly right. The reality is aid, and very often government assistance, are very good at tackling things that are not well served in the market. You're not going to say, okay, Haiti has just been destroyed in an earthquake, which company is going to go in and help these people and sell products? They've got nothing. Nor are you going to say, in particularly in questions of health for the very poorest, there's a whole range of areas where the market just won't provide. And in those cases, when well-focused and well-structured, aid has made a difference. Millions of children have been saved who would otherwise be dead were it not for vaccines or medical treatments of a certain kind. Where I think we've gone wrong is where we've assumed that aid is the key to then unlocking long-term development growth or unlocking the path to prosperity. And very often the danger is you start providing assistance saying, oh, we're only helping in the most desperate cases or in the cases where the market won't provide. But over time, you shift the way people think in an economy. Instead of launching a business, I launch a money-making NGO. Instead of trying to think through what the next big opportunity is, I'm focusing on telling you a sad story about my country so you can give me a grant. And that's where aid can be a problem. But a lot of that is a mindset issue. It requires us, not just at the government level, but as individuals to say, you need to dream big. At the end of the day, if you look at, even today, if you look at the size of the aid flows into Africa versus the amount of wealth that can be created and is being created out of, just making the most of our human and natural resources, aid is a tiny number or a relatively small number. The problem is we don't think big. And so what you then see is people being content to chase the next $1 million grant or rather than to say, how do I build a globally competitive economy or country, right? We should not be talking about in all of Africa only a few entrepreneurs at the level of Aliko Dangote. There's room for dozens of those people. But are we seeing them in Kenya, in Rwanda, in Ghana, etc.? Are we seeing those people who are saying, I'm not going to be satisfied just with the scraps. I want to build a competitive world-class business. And
it could be a long journey,
yeah.
But starting the journey is possibly key, having the confidence.
It starts with a step. Another interesting thing, and maybe this is a different angle to think about, is even in those areas where aid is effective, I think we are seeing ways that we can think of bringing in the private sector. In Kenya, we have seen a lot of companies do very well at combining at finding a role in helping development assistance flow, but then also building viable businesses. You think about the way that, for example, Equity Bank has been visionary in aligning the activities of its foundation with engaging the mass market, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the work Safaricom has done as well, making use of their M-Pesa technology and opening it up for a range of development applications. I think there's a lot of opportunities there. A good example is some of the work we've been doing in Mozambique around rethinking how you pay for healthcare. Now, malaria is a big problem everywhere in Africa, and we typically think of malaria as something that we can only address through government. But government alone very often is not enough. And what people ignore is that malaria is tremendously costly to the private sector. So what we've been thinking about is, what if you said to the private sector, how much will you pay if in X number of years, malaria is eradicated in your area? Don't pay it now, just pay it when the cost of malaria is removed from your books. And there we'll make a certain commitment of a certain sum of money. Turns out that sum of money is actually large enough that you can eliminate malaria, not just from the company's workers, which is impossible anyway, but from the entire district that the company is operating in.
It's fascinating.
And so then you then approach impact investors or NGOs and say, if you're willing to invest up front, and even the government, if you're willing to make the expenditures up front, someone will pay back that money in the future. And it's in thinking about things in that way, in saying, where is it that we can unlock these pools of value? Imagine if we said, how much will you pay if I can keep youth in employment for a year in 5 years from now? And you said it's such and such an amount. I no longer need to go and beg for grants. I just go and borrow from the bank, do my business. At the end of the day, if I can produce well-employed, well-positioned youth, I get my money and I grow and go do something else.
I'm going to mention various sectors to you and just tell me what comes to mind when I mention them. Agriculture.
Africa has more available arable land than the rest of the world put together. We're approaching a new crisis in the world's food supply. Africa has the potential to feed the world. Right now, we produce 10% as much per hectare as the best agricultural countries in the world, despite the fact that the majority of our people are in agriculture. If we can fix that, if we can even just get to half as productive as the rest of the world in the next few years, that will mean growing our agricultural sector 5-fold in a very short period of time. And if we then tap into all of the best science and so on, do sustainable agriculture over the long term, we can become the world's granary at a time when being the world's granary is actually going to be a very lucrative thing.
Wow. Education.
We have the youngest population. We're getting better at educating them. We're having more and more of them getting to secondary education and indeed more into tertiary education. We have been dismal at connecting them to jobs. If we're able to collaborate between employers and the educational sector and build the right kinds of partnerships, it'll be possible both for the private sector to cut the costs of their human capital development because they're getting people who are ready for the workplace, and for education to very clearly convert into meaningful and sustainable jobs. But that requires us rethinking the idea that the university dons and syllabus setters sit in one room and the employers sit in another room. They need to sit in one room and say, what are we doing to give people the experiences they need over the duration of their life that prepare them for the workplace and create the workforce of the future.
Right. Infrastructure.
We have a massive infrastructure deficit. There are trillions of dollars worth of stuck infrastructure projects or even not yet envisaged infrastructure projects. A frightening statistic. If every single power plant that's currently on the books in Africa that's planned to be built is built over the next 10 years, the number of people without electricity in their home will either stay the same or increase. That's if everything happens according to plan. So we actually need to redouble our efforts and recognize that everything from access to clean energy, transportation, communications, those are the things that unlock the power of an economy. If you have energy, you can do a whole lot of other things. Our challenge is that no one is doing the nitty-gritty work of developing the projects. I talked earlier about rolling up your sleeves. Everyone's looking for the big deal. No one's going out there and saying, okay, I'll do the feasibility work. I'll actually prepare a project that is ready to attract investment, both domestic and foreign. And finally, we're not tapping our own indigenous capital, right? Our money is stuck in our mattresses. In some cases, it's stuck in poorly invested, types of funds. We're not really thinking about how Africa's own wealth can unlock the value of Africa's infrastructure, or how we can get creative about paying for infrastructure using the wealth that's still in the ground, whether in our agriculture or in our mining.
Do you think, though, that Africa Development Bank is starting to play that role?
They're doing a great job, and Dalberg does a lot of work with the bank. I have a great deal of respect for the work that particularly Dr. Kaberuka and his team have done over the last few years in really reorienting the bank towards infrastructure. It is a great first step, but it is not going to be enough. And we cannot think of infrastructure as a purely public sector question. If you think about where the US's infrastructure came from, their rail network covering much of the continent, a good chunk of it was built in a 30-year period, financed by private sector entrepreneurship, the Vanderbilts of the world, the Carnegies of the world. The question is, where are those people in Africa? And who is it that's specializing in not chasing the deal and carrying the briefcase around, but in building the capability to bring infrastructure projects to reality.
Quality infrastructure projects.
Exactly.
Finally, please look into the camera and give your message to Africa.
Our challenge as Africa is ultimately to combine prosperity with purpose. It is to find a way to create a society of the future where all of us are moving away from our past and both prospering materially, but also prospering together. Our big challenge, our very, very big challenge, is the desire for shortcuts. And my hope is that as a continent, we are at a point now where we are willing to, first of all, think hard about the opportunities and bring our heads to the opportunities that are out there, but also apply our hearts to thinking about the society as a whole, recognizing that when you combine the two things, a caring for your society and where it's going, as well as an insight into opportunities, that's when you create a prosperous society of the future. And that's when you create that true gem of a future that we're all excited about. You can't do it with one or the other. It has to be both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Powerful stuff. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
This week we end the show with a Tanzanian proverb. Many hands make light work. If each of us is able to recognize our ability to transform this continent, if we each commit to playing our role, and if we just start now, we could so easily move Africa to first world status. What a huge challenge. Blessings to you and blessings to Africa.